I'll hand over to you, Mattia.
Thanks, Alfred, and welcome everybody. So I guess we admitted everybody, yeah, and we'll keep an eye on the waiting room for more attendees. So welcome everybody to our RDM policy webinar for the UWC Library Services and the eResearch Office. I mean, are happy to welcome you to one of our first joint webinars. So we'd like to take a closer look at the Research Data Management Policy that we recently approved via Senate. And we have a couple of colleagues and experts, I mean, in RDM from UWC here with us today. That will guide us, I mean, through the details and through some of the tools, I mean, that you can use to implement the recommendations of the RDM policy. So we will first hear from Mark Snyders about the RDM policy and its recently updated version. Mark is a manager of scholarly communication at the UWC Library Services. And he has been instrumental, I mean, in building RDM awareness and advocacy at UWC over the years. Then we will hear from Ms. Sarah Schäfer, that is the research data specialist at the UWC eResearch Office. Sarah has been with us, I mean, for about a year now, and she's taken on the task of helping Mark and myself and the library to develop, I mean, further tools to support RDM at UWC. I am Mattia Vaccari. I am a professor at UWC, and I also serve as the eResearch director of UWC. I guess without any further ado, I mean, we'll get started. So Mark, why don't you take it away and start sharing your screen?
Okay, good morning, everyone. I am Mark. I am the Manager for Scholarly Communication at the library, as Mattia said. I'd like to start with a bit of context first. So I'm going to close my camera just to show you what the environment that we're living in at the moment. So, excuse me. Thank you. Here's my share button. Okay, so that's my presentation. We'll get to that in a second. I just want to show you a few scary things before we start. So in 2018, this happened. A Harvard cancer researcher faked dozens of images. What happened in this particular case was that the cancer research claims or outputs that were made were based on fraudulent data. And as a result, a number of articles, well, a large number of articles were in fact retracted. And the reason why it was discovered was because somebody wanted to duplicate the research paper using the data, using the data that was made available. In this case, we had a similar one as well, and this resulted in 30 articles being retracted. Again, the data itself was fraudulent. Or at least as was described as was faulty, and it was only discovered when a researcher tried to reproduce the study in order to verify certain results. Now, we'll get to verification at a later stage. That was 2018. This was March as in last month. One of the websites that I use frequently was actually went down in March, and I couldn't figure out why until I did a little bit of digging. The warehouse where the actual data and sites were stored caught fire and destroyed millions of websites, according to the article. The data itself that underpinned a lot of the websites was stored elsewhere, but this is the warehouse where the servers were located is what actually burned down. So a number of the websites have had to be rebuilt. In some cases, backups and backup data was able to support the rebuilding of the websites, but this did not happen in all cases. So As far as the context is concerned, this is these are some of the real world problems we're facing with regard to research data. So onto our policy. Okay, so the seminar is titled Unpacking the UWC Research Data Management Policy. So moving forward, as far as research data is concerned, a number of you will be familiar with the procedure on the left. This one, in case it's your right. So the life cycle of the research data is creating research data or collecting it at the beginning of the process, processing it, analyzing it, preserving the data, providing access to the data, reusing it, and then creating data again from the beginning. The data lifecycle is intricately linked to the research lifecycle. In fact, it is the core of the research lifecycle in terms of making information available or data available to further research or develop further research. So the data lifecycle is one of the things that underpins the policy. On the right, we have something called the FAIR data principles. And these refer to data being findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. These data principles, which were established not too long ago, were also one of the factors or principles that underpin the policy itself. And as we move through it, we'll be able to I'll refer to these, especially the FAIR principles, as we move forward, because they will come up during the policy itself. So a brief overview: the policy was formally adopted in 2021, April, if I remember correctly, or March. Its full name is University of the Western Cape Research Data Management Policy. It is led at executive level by the Vice Chancellor for Research and Innovation. The policy drivers are the eResearch Office, the Research and Development or Research Development Office, and the Library. What's important to remember is that the policy has a 3-year life cycle, so it will be reviewed and adjusted in 3 years' time in case it needs to be updated in any way. Okay, the relevant legislation that applies to the policy includes the Data Protection Act, Patents Act, Copyright Act, etc. The important one is actually the one at the bottom, the Protection of Personal Information Act. This one will come up a few times. As far as the presentation is concerned, please note I am not going to read all of it. We're just going to go through the highlighted and sections and bold sections. Our associated institutional policies are listed here. These are a number of policies that, as far as the university is concerned. Okay, so moving on to the introduction. So as far as the introduction is concerned, this is an extract from the policy itself. But what it basically says is that we are, as far as the world is concerned, we are generating and collecting more research data than at any other time in history. Not all data is research data, but as far as the data is concerned, it is substantial. And as a result, for a university, we do need to make sure that that any data that we collect is managed and made available in an appropriate manner. So as far as the policy is concerned, it encourages research data to be stored in a secure environment with sufficient metadata and documentation. For those of you who are not clear on what metadata means, metadata is essentially a description of your data using a controlled vocabulary. Please bear in mind that information on metadata and what it is can be found online. And as far as the library is concerned, we're here to help you if you have any difficulty with that. One of the main drivers for this policy was a statement by the National Research Foundation, which was made in March of 2015 already. And it basically said that any data supporting publications has to be made available and requires a digital object identifier for citation and referencing purposes. The idea is that any research funded by the National Research Foundation is essentially publicly funded data, and publicly funded research, and the data and the publication or the research output needs to be made available openly. So the purpose of the policy is to facilitate the management of research data at the university and ensure that research data generated by the university is managed and curated carefully. So the policy aims to encourage good RDM practice or research data management practice at the institution under a framework of processes, roles, responsibilities, and support services and facilities for this purpose. So the scope of the policy applies to all employees and students associated with the university. And these may be by formal contract, full-time or employment or part-time, as well as full-time or part-time students who are conducting any kind of research project. As far as the information is, as far as the data is concerned, the policy is applicable to all data being collected for whatever reason at the university, either as a formal or informal project, as far as the university is concerned. So this applies to pretty much anything that can be counted. Not all information will be made public. We will get to that a bit later. But anything or any kind of project, no matter how big or small, that collects research data or collects data, needs to have the data stored in a secure and accessible manner. So the policy framework essentially is to make sure that the research data management is based on principles of reproducible research, data availability and openness, reuse of data, and recognition of legitimate or acceptable limitations of data availability and openness. And that last part we'll get to soon. So the policy principles are particularly important. This section, in fact, guides any kind of activity with regard to research data. And first and foremost, it's important for us to remember that the Protection of Personal Information Act does have a section 19 that discusses the use of identifiable personal information in scientific research. This is particularly important as all of our data needs to be subject to this act. So firstly, the research data generated at the university is public, and as such needs to be made available publicly. The term or the appropriate term that is used is as open as possible and as closed as necessary. And what the second part of that article refers to is any data that needs to be secured and cannot be made public. So any data that can be made public will be done so, and any data that is closed or needs to be embargoed or kept private for some reason will be kept private. However, the data itself does need to be accessible at some point. So identifiable personal data, the second part, needs to be anonymized and de-identified in order to remove direct or indirect identification. As far as identifying personal data is concerned, while it is common for health sciences to work with anonymous data, one of the problems that we have is that it is not only the health sciences where data needs to be kept anonymous. So these are there are some details that, or some projects that will require research data or research papers to remain anonymous or remain embargoed completely. We have had a case recently where dissertation was embargoed permanently because the population pool was so small that it was actually very easy to identify who the participants were, where the data was collected. So in a case like that, for example, there is no way to de-identify or anonymize the data in any way. A particularly curious example. So as far as 4.3 is concerned, it's one of the key features of research data management, and those are the data management plans. These need to be created at the onset of a research project. As the library, we have the ability to assist. Training is available as well. And the DMP, or the data management plan, needs to be declared in accordance with funder requirements and or faculty or department guidelines. The DMP, or the data management plan, is a public document, and it needs to be available and visible to anyone who's interested or has a stake in the project. So aside from the students, the supervisors and all of their colleagues need to be able to see as well, and as well as our research officers as well. So data underpinning masters and PhD projects should be deposited in our institutional research data repository at graduation or by graduation. What this means is that moving forward, all students who register for masters and PhD dissertations need to create a data management plan, and they need to be aware that the data that they collect needs to be made available in the institutional repository. The repository has the ability, the default setting in the repository is that data will be private until it's made public. And the curation process does exist in order to make sure that private data remains private and public data becomes public. Further information will come up later. So data pool, which needs to be stored for a long term, needs to be appropriately preserved, and it needs to remain accessible. So any data, data can be stored for a long period of time. As far as research data is concerned, the 4.6 is particularly important, and we may want to have a brief discussion here, but research data is owned by the university. The international trend is that research data, or all research data created or generated at an institution, is owned by the university. And in our case, unless otherwise agreed to by the university in terms of a research contract, which is concluded with a funder. Bear in mind that as far as research data is concerned, what this means, it is possible, and we have had this case at the university before, where within our health sciences faculty, we had students walking around with health data where the research participants could potentially be identified, walking around with the data on a memory stick or taking it home with them on a laptop. Officially speaking, and in terms of the POPI Act, anyone in possession of data that they should not have, especially personal data of some research participants, could be held liable personally in order to, in terms of releasing or spreading the data or making the data available publicly. The other problem with research data being owned by the university, well, not problem, the other advantage is, and especially data that is being stored securely, is that anyone interested in publishing any kind of work based on the research data, it is important to remember that publishers are now asking for access to the research data in order to verify claims made by any research paper. If the research data is not stored at the university or owned by the university, and stored in an appropriate repository, it is not possible to verify the claims made in the research paper. What the result of that would mean that publishers will start refusing to publish the research output simply because they cannot verify any kind of claims made by the researcher. Okay, moving forward, sufficient metadata should be recorded and made openly available. Metadata is the description of the research using a controlled vocabulary. The metadata record, the metadata record itself will be made public at all times. It will not contain any kind of confidential information, but it may indicate that the data it refers to is confidential. At 4.8, published research results should include information on how to access the supporting data. This is something that PLOS ONE has been doing for a while, and one of the other publishers, MDPI, has also started doing. When a manuscript is submitted for publication, the publisher needs to know where your data is stored, and they need access to it, as I mentioned earlier, in order to verify your results and your claims. This is why it's important for your data to be stored in an appropriate facility, and in our case, preferably our institutional repository. As far as the university is concerned, recognizing that there are legal and ethical and as well as commercial restraints in terms of certain types of research data, confidential research data does need to be stored, but this will not be made public. And our research data repository, our facility does do that. Our researchers may be entitled to a limited period of privileged use. This refers to, for many academics, they tend to hold on to their research, especially the data, in order to try and get as much mileage out of it as possible. So in other words, get as many publications out of it. There is nothing wrong with this process, but the data does eventually need to be shared. So 4.10 makes provision for limited privileged use. So in other words, the data will be made available, but after the researcher has had a reasonable period of time to use as much of the data as possible prior to making it available to other researchers. As far as 4.11 is concerned, all research data users have to acknowledge the source of the research data. This is where the DOI comes in handy. As far as researchers are concerned, when we use research data from another institution or established research data, or data produced by another project or study, it's important when we refer to it that we actually are able to refer to it, and this is where the storage of the data comes in. Our research data repository can actually make a DOI, or a digital object identifier, available for your specific data or the data set. So as far as users are concerned, anyone using the data or using our research data will have a DOI to refer to it or to reference the data that they've used, but also anyone external or from outside the institution using our research data will also cite our research data as well. The current trend at the moment is to make research data citable, and this will increase the research impact for individual researchers as well, or principal investigators. Getting to the end of this process, so research data, especially when we're dealing with a joint research initiative, if you're working, for example, with an NGO that may not have the research facility, the facility or the ability to store research paper, but they do consider themselves owners or at least stakeholders in the research data that was collected. The data itself needs to be stored in our research data facility, in our repository, especially when the external party does not have an appropriate facility to do so. Externally owned data, or data collected or used from an external party. So for example, if someone has used the City of Cape Town's research data or the City of Cape Town's database to collect data from, they need to create a metadata record within the university's institutional research data repository. The metadata record will simply indicate that the data itself that was used and is available elsewhere. So last one. As far as the research data is concerned, any research data collected will be stored for a minimum period of 5 years after completion of the original project. Where intellectual property is involved, and in particular, if there are statutory or contractual agreements, we may require a longer period. A shorter period probably may be applicable as well, depending on the research, on the contract or the agreement that was made. But in some cases, what we'll find is that, especially when it comes to research using human subjects, we may find that raw research data or raw data may need to be kept indefinitely. So what this implies is that, as far as the research data is concerned, for the most part, sharing research data or shared research data is refined research data, or a portion of a refined research data set. So for a particular publication, for example, you may want to share the data only applicable to that publication or research claim. However, the raw research data or the raw data or unrefined data will be required to be stored somewhere. As far as the raw data is concerned, the raw data will never be made public. We will only share refined research data. That process itself is something that we can, as the library, we can help you with. Okay, moving on. Sorry, at this stage, I would like to know if there are any questions before we move on to our responsibilities.
Well, there are a couple of questions on the chat. Yeah, Sarah, go ahead.
Thanks. Sorry, Mark, there are 2 questions on the chat. Would you like me to read them out to you?
Yes, please.
Okay, Razia has asked, she said, health data collected at government health facilities such as Oral Health Center in Tygerberg. Who owns this, and do we have permission to store on the university repository?
Well, no, the health department owns the data. What we need to do is, if it's available to you and you're allowed to use it, that's fine, but you need to create a record or a metadata record on the research data repository, so Kikapu, for those of us who are familiar with it. So you don't actually capture the data itself. All you do on the data repository is say that this is the data that was used and why it was used, and you'll include a DOI to show where it was, the actual data is stored. Okay, next question.
Mark, a question from Kundi. When a project is conducted in partnership with a research institution like SANBI or SAON outside the university, who gets to store the data?
That depends on whether or not the data itself is already stored in a repository, or where the external party has an appropriate facility for it. If they don't, then the data can be stored within the UWC data repository. And depending on whether or not the data needs to be kept private, we can make that happen.
And I will add, sorry, Mark, I would like to add that this is why we would very much like researchers to develop data management plans from the get-go, because this is the sort of thing that people should be thinking about from the get-go.
Thanks, Mattia. I think we're moving on.
One more question from Mariam. How long does the paper or raw data need to be kept? Does the repository have facilities for the storage? The
refined data has to be kept for a minimum of 5 years. The raw data would be kept for a would also be kept for a minimum of 5 years. It also depends on the content of the data or the research project. It also depends on the contract, assuming if the data is, or if the research project is conducted in conjunction with an external partner. As far as raw data is concerned, what we need to remember when it comes to the fair data principles is that we need to make sure that the data itself is accessible. As far as raw data is concerned, it will only be accessible to the researcher or the stakeholders within the project, and only the refined data will become public. So when it comes to raw data, it's I can't really tell you how long it will be kept, because it does need to be accessible, especially where somebody wants to verify the results of the project. So that one is a bit difficult, but that is something that we can continue to discuss. For now, though, as far as the policy is concerned, it does indicate that the raw data does need to be stored in a repository. It just won't be public. Okay, I think we can move forward. Please note that we'll have some time for discussion a little bit later as well. So going back to the policy, we also have university responsibilities and researcher responsibilities, which are listed in the policy itself. And with regard to the university responsibilities, essentially the university is responsible for providing and enabling a research environment for research data stewardship and governance. So what that means is the university is responsible for making the facility available and providing guidance with regard to the management of research data. It is also important to remember that the Senate Research Committee is responsible for ensuring good data practice or good research data management procedures to protect the university in case against any kind of risk. That risk is essentially related to the release or leaking of compromised or confidential data. The Research Committee is also responsible for monitoring the compliance of researchers with the policy itself. The policy is not clear on how that's going to happen, but guidance will be forthcoming. In the last paragraph, the research development, library and eResearch units are responsible for providing guidance, advocacy, disposal and capacity building to support good research practice. This essentially refers to the training that has been made available, as well as the advice that is available to all researchers within the university with regard to data management practices. When it comes to the researcher responsibilities, things get a little more complicated. The researchers are responsible for documenting the storage and data management requirements. So in other words, the data management plan. As Mattia indicated, moving forward, all researchers or all research projects will have to have a data management plan. And this will explain how research data is going to be collected, what is going to be collected, where it is going to be stored, and how it is going to be shared. These processes, we have a training sessions that can help as far as creating a data management plan is concerned. So as anyone who's interested, they're free to contact us or keep watching the library notice board or the UWC emails. As far as the responsibilities go, before we get there, it's important to remember that your data management plan needs to be stored with your data on the data repository. So when it comes to the principal investigators, there are a couple of things that they are accountable for. When you're working on a group project, all participants need to register. All participants register for and use an ORCID when depositing research data. For anyone who's not familiar with this term, an ORCID is an Open Researcher and Contributor ID. It is essentially similar to a passport number or an ID number for a researcher. This number is applicable to individual researchers only, and it is a registered number. So it can be used to search for you and your publications as well. Research groups need to implement good data practice. Again, we have training sessions available to explain all of that. as far as the data is concerned, it needs to be handled in accordance with UWC policies and our legal, ethical, and regulatory and contractual obligations. A data management plan is in place for the life cycle of the research project. So again, the data management plan is a crucial plan or a crucial document that does need to accompany any research project. And then the data management practices are compliant with the POPI Act. And in this case as well, again, it's come up several times, but all data needs to be tested against the Protection of Personal Information Act. Okay. So beyond that, we just need to go to the appendices quickly. So as far as fair data principles are concerned, again, research needs to be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, and this is an international standard. The data management plan needs to be submitted, or researchers are encouraged to submit a data management plan that will outline the life cycle of the research project. Bear in mind that a data management plan is a live document and it can be adapted, or it should be adapted as the project proceeds. As far as depositing research data is concerned, researchers and PIs are responsible for depositing the research data, the validity and authenticity of the content submitted. So in other words, if there are any problems or difficulties with regard to the data itself that has been submitted, the responsibility of correcting those lies with the researcher or the principal investigator. Just before that, if you have received data from an external party, you need to acknowledge permission to have used it. Okay. Metadata standards. As far as the metadata is concerned, this is a description of your research data. The institutional data repository will guide you in terms of your description of your data that you intend to store and make available. Appropriate descriptions can be discussed with the library if you're not sure how to do that. As far as storage is concerned, your research data has to be stored in the institutional repository. It can store any format and it can store any file size. So it's important to be aware of that. We do not necessarily have to stick to small sizes or small amounts of research data. But if we do store your data in a subject-specific repository, as far as some of our subject areas are concerned, there are repositories available for specific subjects. ArchiveX, for example, is available for astrophysics and astronomy. If astrophysics and astronomy students or projects have data that they collected, it can be stored with them. However, a metadata record of that with a link to that project or that storage facility does need to be created within our data repository. And as far as confidential data is concerned, it must be secured appropriately in compliance with ethical and legal requirements.
Mark, can we speed it up a little bit, because I suspect we are running a little out of time. Thanks.
We are just about done. Okay, so as far as the rest of the document is concerned, the appendices, we discuss version control, data discovery and citation, ethics and reuse. As far as the information that we've discussed here are extracted from the policy itself, and they are available. This presentation will be made available as well. At this moment, I'd like to hand over to Sarah, who will discuss some of our facilities available, especially the data repository for the university. So thank you, Sarah. Please continue.
Thanks, Mark. I'll just close here with a comment. I mean, and we'll get to some of the extra questions after Sarah's presentation. I think the way the policy is worded is understandably rather prescriptive. I mean, that's the nature of a policy document. it should be borne in mind that, I mean, UWC will do its best, I mean, to support researchers in this endeavor while trying to act as the gatekeeper, I mean, to try and make sure, I mean, that the data is secure and the like. But I think the thrust of these activities, I mean, should also be on the researcher side. I mean, the researcher is the main actor and should develop, I mean, the skills to do that, but also should develop the understanding of why this is required in the first place. So case in point, I mean, the data is often lost, I mean, because people don't think carefully about the data management plan, and they're unclear about what the privacy restrictions are, or what tools are available to store the data long term. So that's why we are here to help, and that's what the policy is trying to crystallize. So as any crystallization effort is not perfect, and it doesn't stand still, I mean, for too long, but we are here to help and to answer all the questions. So please get in touch with us also outside, I mean, these webinars. Thanks. Go ahead, Sarah.
Thanks, Mattia. I'm going to share my screen quick. Okay, thanks very much, Mark. I'm Sarah Schäfer. I'm an RDM specialist and I work in the eResearch office. Mark and I work very closely together on everything RDM related at UWC. I'm going to give a brief overview of the RDM tools available to the UWC academic community that will help researchers achieve what the RDM policy sets out. Sorry, next slide. Okay. Good research data management is an essential part of research, and it's becoming more and more relevant and necessary. Publishers and funding bodies now require that research data is made available in a way that adheres to the fair data principles. Every researcher has data. All of the physical or digital material which underpin your published research outputs are research data. These could be any kind of format. They could be from photographs of archival documents and reading notes to spreadsheets. They could be 3D models or programming scripts. Research data can be qualitative or quantitative and can be a few kilobytes to a few gigabytes in size. There are no set rules. Researchers are expected to use RDM tools in order to streamline their workflows and make their research more efficient and more visible. I'm going to do a brief overview of Kikapu, which is our institutional data repository. At the end of the presentation, I'll let everyone know that there are videos available and there is more training available, but for now, this is just going to be a very kind of broad overview of what it offers. Kikapu is UWC's institutional research data repository. It provides a data storage facility where research data can be securely stored, shared, and managed. Like Mark explained, funders like the NRF and publishers require that research data supporting projects and publications be made available in a data repository. In line with the global movement towards sharing research data, UWC is committed to data being as open as possible and as closed as necessary. Kikapu is powered by Schäfer for institutions, and all UWC students and staff can access the system with their novel credentials. Users can make all of their research outputs available in a citable, shareable, and discoverable manner. Schäfer for institutions is used by hundreds of universities and institutions around the world as their institutional data repositories. These include the Smithsonian, it includes the University of Utrecht, Stockholm University. Locally, it includes Stellenbosch, UCT, UWC, of course, CPUT, Rhodes University. It's very widely used and reliable. ISO certified infrastructure means that the Schäfer system is extremely secure. Schäfer is ISO 27001 compliant. This is a specification for an information security management system known as an ISMS. This is a framework of policies and procedures that includes all legal and technical controls involved in an organization's information risk management process. Moreover, Schäfer is a data site node. This means that researchers can get a DOI, which is a digital object identifier for uploaded digital objects. A DOI can be for a whole project or for a specific file. Users can upload any kind of data and a DOI can be minted for that object. A DOI is a persistent and unique link to that digital object. This could be a research paper or a data set, an audio file from interview or an image or anything in between. DOIs are really important in academic citation because they are more permanent than a URL, and it ensures that your reader can reliably locate the source. Using a platform like Kikapo has been shown to increase citations by up to 25% and boost research metrics. Research data being FAIR, which is an acronym for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, is one of the cornerstones of RDM, and Kikapo simplifies this process for researchers. I'm going to go through the FAIR data principles very quickly. First, the F in FAIR stands for findable. The findable principle is about making sure that data is stored with a persistent identifier, that it's well described with rich metadata and indexed in as many relevant searchable resources as appropriate. This allows data to always be able to be found by a single URL despite any changes or migrations, and promotes its discovery across multiple platforms. The A is for accessible. The accessible principle ensures that data can be accessed via standard non-proprietary protocols and that metadata is stored in perpetuity. This allows the simple access of data now and future-proofs the provenance of data in the event that it can't be stored long-term due to storage limitations. The I is for interoperability. The interoperable principle promotes the use of formal, accessible, shared, and broadly accepted language for knowledge representation. This allows metadata and data to be accessed and retrieved in a number of different formats and promotes the free flow of data between systems. Reusable. The reusability principle encourages researchers to upload metadata and data that is richly described in the domain-relevant community standards. This should provide enough context to allow a peer to understand, reproduce, and build on top of the original work. Okay, I'm going to give a brief overview of REDCap, which UWC recently started officially using last year, although we know that there are many researchers at UWs who have been using REDCap for several years. REDCap is another tool that UWC researchers have in their toolkit. The eResearch office is now a partner in the REDCap consortium, and UWC researchers can benefit from the range of data collection functionality that it offers. At its most simple, REDCap is a web-based interface that empowers researchers to take control of their data collection. It was originally created to support a very small group of clinical researchers who needed a secure data collection tool, but today it is used as a secure method of data collection by thousands of researchers at institutions around the world. So it's another very highly rated and reliable tool. All students and staff members at UWC can create a REDCap profile with their novel credentials, and projects can vary from simple 10-question surveys to broad clinical trials that deal with confidential information. Data collected can then be downloaded in various formats for analysis and visualization. REDCap is a neutral data collection platform. It's able to capture any type of data for any purpose. The third thing I'm going to be speaking about is data management planning, which Mark spoke about quite a bit. A data planning process ensures that all aspects of data management are holistically explored at the beginning of a research project. When planning research or developing an application for funding, researchers should be thinking about how to manage, store, and organize data during the research activity and after the research is completed. This RDM strategy needs to be formalized into a data management plan, known as a DMP. And a DMP is a written document that formalizes the strategy. The document should outline and describe how data will be acquired, how it will be managed, described, analyzed, stored, preserved, shared, how it might be deleted after a certain amount of time, all through the course of the research project. These documents can evolve with the research project and can develop as the project progresses. No two DMPs will ever be the same, and elements will vary from broad descriptions to extremely technical details. UWC's RDM policy expects all researchers to have a DMP in place before a new research project begins. And like Mark said, this DMP should be stored with the research data for that project in the institutional repository, Kikapu. This is in line with the NRF as well as many international funding bodies. A data management plan can be created in various ways. There is a UWC specific spreadsheet that has been created that researchers can use to guide their planning. We'll share a link to that. And it's also available on a website, on the eResearch and library websites. And there are several free and openly accessible online tools like DMP Online, which was originally created by the Digital Curation Center. Okay, the library and eResearch have created informative videos, and an RDM module is available on eCumber. The videos include demonstrations on uploading research data to Kikapu, the fair data principles, data management planning, and open access. And we invite you all to have a look at those. If there are further questions for any specific technical details, please contact RDM support. That's Mark and I, and we'll get back to you with anything that you need. We also organize further training and webinars. And the library and the eResearch team will be conducting an RDM survey in the upcoming weeks. And we ask that everyone participates in order for us to be able to calibrate our services and training accordingly. Thanks very much. I'm going to stop my sharing now.
Thanks, Sarah. That was a quick and useful recap of some of the things that we were recently busy with. And as we mentioned extensively, I mean, we are always happy, I mean, to hear from you. And we do have a collection of resources, including videos, I mean, from recent webinars and web pages, I mean, that you can browse, I mean, in order to go through the basics of the DMP tools, but also of REDCap and Kikapu. And should you want to take them for a spin, I mean, you can just log into kikapu.uwc.ac.za, and similarly for REDCap, and well, get started and get in touch with us, I mean, if you have any questions. Now, there were a few questions, and I will do my best, I mean, to do justice to all of them, although, I mean, the chat was very lively, so I might have missed some. So I would also encourage you, I mean, to speak up, I mean, if your question has not been addressed in detail, I mean, by the end of the talk. So I would also like to, well, welcome back, I mean, Alfred Nqotole from the library. He's Deputy Director for Research Support and Scholarly Communication. He had to rush to an urgent meeting at the beginning of the talk, but he's now back, so he will also be able to answer some of your questions. What questions I will be missing? Let me go in chronological reverse order. Okay. So there was a question for Miriam about the REDCap online and offline use. I'm not sure what REDCap for offline use is, but that might be because I'm not hugely familiar with the tool. I mean, the way I understand it, I mean, REDCap is basically an online continuously accessible repository, but maybe there is an offline functionality that I'm not aware of.
I believe that there is REDCap offline, which can be used as a standalone version. I haven't tried it, so I can't speak from experience, but we can, if you pop us an email, I can look into that further and let you know. So
that would be for a researcher to use it offline for data taking in the field, for instance? I
imagine so.
Okay, right. Thanks, Miriam. Okay, yeah, great. We haven't explored that as yet, but we'll be happy to do that. I mean, it's still early days.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, then going backward, there was a question about more stringent protocols need to be admitted when submitting proposals to review committees, and perhaps even at this point of a reserve ODI number, well, DOI number on approval of ethics. Yes, that's a good point. Not more a comment than a question. So Mark and Sarah, you might also want to browse, I mean, through the chat history to pick up any questions that we left off, since I was listening to you in the process. So there was a question about REDCap, REDCap's and Kikapu's capacities and the like. I mean, these are probably better answered, I mean, via email. But in a nutshell, I mean, I don't think we are limited, I mean, by storage capacities. I mean, and we do offer technical support to some extent. So please get in touch with us and detail, I mean, your requirements. So if you are a regular REDCap user, would very much like to be able to host your projects on our UWC instance going forward. So thanks, Tamrin. So was there, well, please let me know, I mean, if I missed your question. I mean, it can be tricky to go through the chat.
Someone earlier when spoke about reserving a DOI for ethics approval. There we go, Mariam. Yes, it's absolutely possible to reserve a DOI on Kikapu. So that should be a very straightforward process.
Yes, and again, I mean, I'll also stress, I mean, something that we often forget when we give these, general talks. I mean, there are, of course, lots of, discipline-specific repositories, I mean, that are popular and well-maintained, I mean, by the community. So we, as much as, we do offer, I mean, our own repository. We are also, I mean, very happy, I mean, for researchers, I mean, to use their repositories of choice, particularly when they think that this will increase the visibility of their research. I think the support that we offer is more an entry-level sort of support, I mean, that can get researchers on the right track. Then as they develop their understanding of how data are shared in their specific disciplines, we can also advise about what other repositories might be handy. And we are very happy, I mean, to hear from you about your experiences using other repositories, of course, because they might come in handy when we provide support to future users.
I'd like to come in as well. I see Cedric mentioned is a student funding their own studies considered a funder? Can you negotiate a contract? As far as the self-funded students are concerned, we often come across this question in terms of ownership of research data. Please bear in mind, as I mentioned in the during my discussion point, when you go to publish an article or your research paper, including your dissertation, it may, at some point in time, someone might come along and challenge your assumptions or your findings and your research results. And in order to prove your position and your claim, the research data actually needs to be made available. Now, if you choose to keep it, or if you believe yourself to be the owner of the research data, you will have to find a way to store it in some fashion that will allow access to anyone who wants to challenge your research data or use your data to repeat your research. Your funders themselves, for example, will also want to know, not funders, publishers, will also want to know where your research data is being stored so that they can verify your claims. So as I said, if you've got it on a memory stick in your house, it negates the purpose of, it negates, it reduces the chances of someone actually confirming your results. And it also reduces the chances of your paper being published, simply because someone cannot verify your results. So as far as ownership of research data is concerned, that's an argument that will probably go on for a while. But as far as this policy is concerned, it's important to remember that the research data needs to be stored in an appropriate facility. And this is why we encourage students to use the UWC Research Data Facility. There was a question in terms of REDCap, and I believe University of, I think it was North Carolina. If the research data is stored on a repository at another institution, you don't have to store the data, you don't have to make a copy of it and store it with us or store it at UWC. All you need to do is to create a metadata record. So in other words, you create a description in the UWC repository and you put the link to where the data is being stored as part of that record. So that if anyone does come across, does search the UWC repository, they will have access to that data. Okay, thank you. That's it from me.
Thanks, Mark. And in terms of how we are trying to advocate and advertise, I mean, this policy, we do have a series of initiatives. I mean, both already well behind us and in the future. I think it's also important that researchers within their departments, become advocates for this. So I would seriously consider, I would seriously invite you, to take these tools, for a spin, and then perhaps, organize, little workshops, with your graduate students and with your staff members in order to better advertise, the availability of these new tools. I find that senior staff members in particular, have got limited bandwidth to adopt, new tools. So junior staff members and also the more active and enterprising postgraduate students are often best placed, to make progress, in changing the culture within departments and institutes. So if you need any help, setting this up, or if you need extra resources, to help you organizing, these little seminars, please let us know. Okay, so if there are no further questions we might have missed off the chat or now on the air, I think we could close now, and we will send them in the recording of the webinar, to register participants, and we will add them to our web pages, for further perusal. So thanks again, Mark and Sarah and Alfred behind the scenes. I hope that was useful. So I'll see you hopefully, during one of our more in-depth training webinars about the different tools sometime soon. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mattia. Mark, can you remain on the call? Sarah, Mattia?
Thanks. Right here.
Absolutely. Shall I stop the recording for now?
Yeah.
Okay.